Welcome to you all. I'm going to make a few videos, short videos. First one we're going to discuss is the daily halacha, the mixture of meat and dairy, and the source for this prohibition in the Torah. We're going to make a video on the daily Tanya, the daily Chumash of the day, and we'll make also a video on Ein Yaakov, a narrative of the Talmud. So we'll start with the laws of meat and dairy. It says in the Torah you are not allowed to cook the kid. Kid is a lamb, in Hebrew gedi, b'chalev imoy, with its mother's milk. That's the original prohibition in the Torah. It's actually written three times in the Torah, and one time is teaching us not to eat it. The second time it teaches us not to cook it. We're not allowed to cook such a mixture, and the third time is not to derive any benefit from such a mixture. If it was already cooked, we're not allowed to benefit from it. But the rabbis taught us that the commandment is not necessarily limited to a kid. Rather, it's any pure animal that was cooked with the milk of a pure animal. When I say pure animal, I mean animal that has split hooves and it chews its cud. So if you take meat from a kosher animal and you take milk from a kosher animal, you cook them together, this is the prohibition that the rabbis explained, that when it says you're not allowed to cook the kid with its mother's milk, the rabbi said that this is the prohibition also when it comes to a meat and dairy that are coming from a kosher animal. Why does the Torah uses the word the milk of its mother if it's a general prohibition on any kind of meat and milk? Why specifically its mother's milk? Because the Torah spoke about an incident that was very common, that they used to slaughter a young calf, young kid, and they would take advantage of the mother's milk to use it for the cooking of the kid. It was a common practice. I guess it was more practical. The Rambam actually writes, Maimonides right, that it has also the aspect of cruelty. That's another reason why the Jewish people were commanded not to do it. But in general, this was a common practice. That's why the Torah uses its mother's milk, but not to limit the prohibition to its mother's milk, but any kosher milk and any kosher meat. So as I said in the beginning, this prohibition repeated itself three times in different places in the Torah. And so we learned the three prohibitions: eating, cooking, and deriving benefit. Deriving benefit could mean, like for example, feeding it to your dog. The fact that you, let's say by mistake, you made such a mixture, you don't want to throw it out, you're giving it to your dog, so you derive benefit because now you don't have to feed your dog. So there is any direct benefit. Also, even giving it to your neighbor, now he owes you something, you did a favor to him, you gave him a nice meal. So we're not allowed to do that either. The rabbis made what we call a siag, a fence, so we shouldn't come to such mistake. So they said they're not allowed to eat the meat of an animal with milk. And with that prohibition, under that category, you also have the meat of a wild animal, a non-domesticated animal, and the meat of a chicken, of a fowl with milk. And even if they were mixed together while they were cold and they were not cooked together, still not allowed to eat them. You might say, okay, I didn't cook them together. They were just mixed after they were both cooked and they're cold now. So maybe they're not transferring flavor and so on. The rabbi said it's still, we don't want you to come to a violating a biblical prohibition, so any kind of mixture of meat and milk together will be prohibited. Now, when it comes to the flavor of meat that was mixed with milk, flavor, how's it possible? For example, if you using a pot that you usually accustomed to use it for meat, you're putting a pot roast and the like, you're cooking with it, and one day you decided to make some dairy dish like lasagna. So using it now for something dairy. So the pot is giving out some flavors from the meat, because you're usually using it for meat, and the dairy dish is going to absorb some of those flavors. So that's an example of the flavor of the meat that was mixed with milk. So when it comes to the prohibition of meat and dairy that the Torah prohibited, is not only the mixture of pieces of meat with pieces of cheese or dairy, but also the mixture of flavor that comes out from the meat with flavor that comes out from the milk. Therefore, meat that was mixed with cheese, and there's still flavor in the cheese from the meat. So now the cheese is tasting, there is some meat flavor in the cheese, or vice versa. You're not allowed to eat the cheese, even if you took out now the meat and the cheese are not mixed together. You separated them, but the fact that they came together and they gave each other flavors, they shared flavors, and now there is flavor of the meat in the cheese, it's prohibited. Now, what is the measure? What does it mean giving flavor? How much flavor? It says it all depends of how the contact took place. So if the meat and the cheese were both cold, took them out of the refrigerator, by mistake they came together, so the flavor is only on the spot where they came in contact with each other. The meat and the cheese came in contact. But in a case where the meat and the cheese were hot and the flavor was absorbed in the entire piece of meat or in the entire piece of cheese, so that is another type of contact, another type of transmitting flavor. When it comes to cold, it's only in the area that it touched, and therefore if you remove that area, it might make it okay. But when it comes to both of them are very hot and they're touching each other, now the flavor is transmitted in the entire piece of meat and the entire cheese. So the prohibition of mixing meat and dairy is not only in the meat and the dairy itself, but also in the flavor that is tasted, but not necessarily visible. It doesn't have to be visible, but it needs to be something that you can taste. If you were to taste it, you can taste the meat, or you can taste in the meat, you can taste the cheese. So therefore, a pot that was cooked primarily with meat, so the flavor of the meat is now absorbed in the pot, and if you would cook milk in it, it would give out, the flavor of the meat would come out, and it would go into the milk that you are now cooking in it. And now also the flavor of the milk is going to be in the pot. They have the milk and you have the meat. They are now coming together, and this could be a possibility of cooking meat and milk together, even though it's a fleishik pot, it's a meat pot, and there's no meat in there, and you're only cooking dairy in it.
So you're getting a taste of tom.
Right, but the thing is, you only have one item, but you can still violate the prohibition of cooking meat and milk together, just for the fact that the moment that you heat that pot, the flavors of the meat are coming out and being absorbed in the milk. We'll continue with the next video on the Tanya.